So on its own, the electric guitar is sort of an incomplete instrument. It needs the amplifier. The two work together to become this sort of symbiotic organism. The guitar amp and the guitar in the same space interact with each other to create sort of a new sound. And it was this sound that helped develop rock music in the 50s and 60s and onward. But what's interesting is I think we can point to 3 specific guitar amplifiers that changed rock history forever. Had these 3 different amps not come on the scene when they did and where they did, I don't think music history would be the same. I don't think the bands would have sounded the same. I think many of the famous players that we point to now as our heroes would have maybe even made it had they not had access to these tools that they used to develop their sounds, which are now iconic. So in today's video, I'm gonna show you these 3 different amplifiers. 2 of them are real vintage examples that I was able to get my hands on. One of them is a modern reissue of the vintage amp. But all 3 of these amps are different. They're unique, they do their own thing, and they're really cool. But before we jump into the video, a quick plug for my new guitar course, the lead guitar course called Crafting Tasteful Solos. It's linked in the description box down below if you want to find out more information about it, as well as the other courses that I have available. It's a great way to support this channel if you like what I'm doing over here. All right, with all that out of the way, let's take a look at the first amp. Now, before we talk about the first amp, we need to understand a little bit of history. In 1946, a man in Southern California named Leo Fender was working as a repair technician for local theaters and clubs in the area, repairing their early PA systems, their early sound systems. Now, Leo was not a musician. He didn't play guitar or any other instrument, but he was obsessed with electronics since he was a kid, obsessed with radios and radio technology. And he saw an arising need at the time, which was the need for musicians in touring bands, primarily Western swing bands, to amplify their electric instruments. So in the late 1940s, around 46, he starts designing amplifier circuits. Now also around this time, in 1951, Fender releases the first ever precision bass. The amps they were building at the time, like the Deluxe, didn't have the headroom or the power to handle the bass, to handle the low end frequencies, and so they would break up and just weren't loud enough. So in 1952, they released the first Bassman amplifier. And this amp, the Bassman, would go on through several iterations through the late 1950s to become one of the best and most iconic guitar amps of all time.
The Fender 5F6-A Fender Bassman is most likely the greatest Fender amp of all time. It had very humble beginnings. It started out as the companion for the then new precision bass. It had a single 15-inch Jensen speaker and a ported back, and it did an awful job. The 15-inch Jensen speakers got blown. It just produced kind of a low compressed mess. It was not able to handle the low E string of the precision bass. And so Leo and company did a complete redesign. So they made the brilliant decision to use 4 10-inch P10R Jensen speakers, which necessitated the enlargement of the cabinet. If we think of acoustic guitars, well, a smaller bodied acoustic guitar isn't going to produce a lot of low end. Of course, a larger cabinet or a larger acoustic guitar will produce more low end. The same is true for the cabinet on a guitar amplifier. So all these came together to produce a good bass amp, but it made for an incredible guitar amp. I have a friend in his early 80s that bought a Tweed Fender Bassman brand new in 1957, and he was a guitarist, and he told me that it was already known as really the best guitar amp that you could get from Fender. So it ended up being used by everyone from Fred Carter Jr. with the Hawks, who of course would pass on his love of the Tweed Bassman to Robbie Robertson. You have people like Buddy Guy, all sorts of guitarists in country, rock and roll, Fran Breacher with Bill Haley and the Comets. Later on, people would really covet the sound, and it's really one of the most collectible Fender amps of all time.
at the time, the Bassman was the primary gigging amp for bands in the United States and in England. And in West London, there was a man named Jim Marshall who was a businessman. He owned a music store that was supplying local bands with their gear, and he was also a drummer. Now, Jim Marshall was importing Bassmans from the United States and selling them to young musicians and local bands touring based out of London at the time, but it was expensive. Import taxes, long wait times, and a few other factors led to really limited availability of the Bassman in England, and so Jim Marshall saw a business opportunity to basically start building his own amps and selling them out of his shops instead of the Bassmans that were so hard to get. But unlike Leo Fender, Jim Marshall wasn't an amp designer or an engineer. So he reached out to two local engineers, Dudley Craven and Ken Brand, and they took a Bassman and essentially made their own version of it, and that amp became known as the JTM45. So now Jim Marshall's in the amp business. He's selling these JTM45s to local players on the scene in London, people like Pete Townsend, for example. And it wasn't long before players like Pete Townsend came to Marshall and said, I need more power, I need a louder amplifier. These bands were starting to play bigger venues to more people. PAs at the time were primarily for the vocals, so guitar players and bass players basically needed to bring their own PAs with them, and a 45-watt amp, while loud by today's standards, just didn't have enough horsepower to get over the rest of the band and over the screaming crowds that were there to see these young rock bands. And this amp is the Black Flag JTM100 from 1967. Now, I borrowed this amp from my buddy Ford Fry here in Atlanta, who's got an impressive collection of vintage gear. Today, we think of the Marshall sound as being this loud, powerful, rock, tons of overdrive sound. But at the time, when these amps were developed, that wasn't their purpose. They were designed to just be cleaner and louder so that they could be heard. Now, to me, the reason the Plexi is one of the three most important amps ever is what it did for players at the time. This was an attempted solution to a problem that players were facing. They needed to be louder. And this high power, high headroom amplifier allowed players like Hendrix and Townsend to play cleaner at louder volumes, which is what they wanted. But you also had sort of a side effect. As you start to push this amp to its limit, it doesn't necessarily get louder, but it does start to break up and compress and add sustain to your sound. And it does this in a super musical way. And it was players like Clapton and Townsend and Hendrix that took this sound and ran with it. They took this loud, sustained, compressed, overdriven lead guitar sound and sort of unlocked a new direction for guitar players of the mid-60s that were playing around London. You have to keep in mind, this is the early days of distortion being used in popular music. Up until this time, people like Leo Fender were trying to get distortion out of their amplifiers. They wanted loud and clean. But it was players like Hendrix and Clapton and Townsend utilizing the Marshalls, the Plexis, and pushing them to their limits to unlock this incredibly musical new way of playing guitar that nowadays is sort of synonymous with the electric guitar sound. Around the same time that Fender was perfecting the Bassman in 1958, over in England, a man named Dick Denny joined on with JMI, Jennings Musical Instruments. Like Leo Fender, Dick Denny was an electronics wizard, and he went on to design the first Vox amplifier, the AC15, for JMI in 1958. Tom Jennings, the owner and founder of JMI, saw the same need that Leo Fender and Jim Marshall would see, that young bands at the time touring around England needed amplifiers. amplifiers for their gigs. So the AC15 was the first Vox amp to hit the scene in the late 1950s. It was a 112 15 watt combo. Interesting little side note, you can hear an early AC15 on the James Bond theme from Dr. No. That was a guitar player by the name of Vic Flick, who played the iconic James Bond guitar lead line. Now, it didn't take long for Dick Denny to figure out that, like Marshall, guitar players needed louder amps. They needed more power for their gigs. So that's when they designed and released the AC30. It's essentially an AC15, but with twice the power and twice the speakers. It's a 212 combo instead of a 112. And the AC30, like the Bassman and like the Plexi, is one of the most important amplifiers of all time.
The problem with AC30s is there are just so many different versions of the amp. Even if we limit it down to the classic JMI era of the 1950s and 60s, there are still so many different versions of the amp. We have the original AC30 with a single 12 and two EL34s. It's exceedingly rare. We have the Fawn 212 version with an EF86 preamp. We have the next version, which eliminates the EF86 because it was microphonic. Then you have the normal treble and bass versions of the AC30. Then we have the add-on top boost. And then you have, was the add-on top boost to a normal treble or bass version? And then let's talk about transformers. They used a lot of different manufacturers, and those contribute to different sounds from the amp. Is it an Albion equipped AC30 or is it a Woden? But if I had to be, staked down to say what is the classic AC30 sound, it would probably be a mid-60s AC30 top boost with, of course, the classic Celestion Alnico Blue speakers. That is the classic AC30 sound.
Now, you can't talk about Vox in the early 1960s without talking about the Beatles. The Beatles essentially put Vox on the map. And for a long time, I was under the impression that the Beatles almost exclusively used AC30s. But when I bought my vintage AC30 about 2 years ago, I learned that by the time the Beatles played on Ed Sullivan in America in '64, they had already switched to the AC50. And as you can probably guess, the theme here, they needed bigger amps with more power. But the AC30 has stuck around, and it's become one of the most beloved amps by guitar players since then. Brian May is another famous AC30 user. And the way he used his Red Special guitar and treble boosters to push those amps to their absolute limit and record some of the most recognizable guitar sounds and guitar solos ever put to tape. For me, it makes the AC30 one of my favorite amps of all time. Of these three amps, the AC30 is the one I would pick if I could only have one amp. It's got the versatility of the Bassman. It's got high headroom cleans. It takes pedals incredibly well. It records incredibly well. Like the Bassman, it's loud enough to get over just about any gig I would ever find myself on. And when you push the AC30 to its limit, specifically my vintage 64, it has one of my favorite overdrive sounds ever. I haven't found a pedal or another amp or a digital profile or anything that breaks up and sounds like that particular amp, my 64. It's an absolute lifer amp for me. I'll never get rid of it. It truly is a dream amp. Man, I love guitar amps. They're probably one of my favorite parts of being a guitar player, honestly. Finding an amp that you connect with is one of the best experiences that you can have as a guitar player, in my opinion. And these three amps, I really believe, are the three most important amps in guitar history. Without them, we wouldn't be where we are today in music. We wouldn't have, I think, a lot of the guitar heroes that we do. And guitar wouldn't be progressing in the direction that it is now with today's modern players, without the players and the gear and the tools that they used in the past to create some of our favorite music. I want to quickly give a huge thank you to a few people for making this video possible. First of all, Zach Childs. If you're not hip to Zach's channel, ask Zach. I'll have it linked down below. He's one of my favorite guitar YouTubers. Every video he puts out is so chock full of valuable information for a vintage guitar nerd like myself. He has an immense amount of experience in this industry, and he could not be a nicer or more down-to-earth guy. So go show Zach some love. Follow him on YouTube. Also, thanks to Ford Fry for loaning me his very rare and very special Black Flag JTM. And also, I want to thank Sweetwater. They overnighted me this Bassman to use for the video. I called all over Atlanta and couldn't find one to buy or to borrow for the video. So Sweetwater overnighted me this used one from their used inventory. Thank you to Sweetwater for loaning me this amp and making the video possible. And if you didn't know, you can now buy and sell used gear on Sweetwater, which is actually where this amp came from. So as always, everything's linked in the description box down below. If you haven't subscribed, please do. It really helps the channel out and helps me make these videos. According to my analytics, still over half the people that watch this channel on a regular basis are not subscribed, and it really does help me out when you click that red button. As always, my name is Rhett Shull. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.